Hello, hello. I'm running around a lot today. I just got out of the shower. I'm waiting for my hair to dry. And while I wait for my hair to dry, I thought I would throw together another quick sort of writing tips thing. Um, or just like techniques in action, however you want to call it. It's one that I've been wanting to make for a few days because I'm really interested in it. And as you can tell by the title of my little doc, it's about implicit versus explicit dialogue. I've heard other terms like concrete versus abstract dialogue, subjective versus object. There's all different ways of looking at it. Um, it fits kind of under the banner of show versus tell, but it's obviously much more specific, and I think it's more specific in an important way. So let's start with just like some examples of dialogue. Just start with dialogue. Um, so for instance, oops, there we go. How's your mother? Wanda asked. Right? So this is what I would call explicit dialogue. Wanda is saying words and we know exactly what those words are, right? She's fine, Sheila replied. Thank you for asking, right? So this is so it's an implicit it's an explicit dialogue exchange back and forth. Both people are speaking. We know exactly what it is that they are saying, not just the meaning of what they're saying, but their exact words, right? Which can, in this case, this is very basic dialogue. It doesn't actually contain much about the characters. It doesn't have much in the way of idiosyncrasies or any of that. And that's another thing. That's part of why explicit dialogue can be useful, because if you take the time to put idiosyncrasies and characterizations in, it can communicate a lot. Um, what is implicit dialogue? Well, let's do an example of that. His mother is doing, she answers that her mother is doing fine. Okay, so what is this? This is implicit. Wanda asks how Sheila's mother is doing. Now, if we ignore the example that I started with, right? Just pretend that doesn't exist for a moment, right? Close your eyes, pretend that. Wanda asks how Sheila's mother is doing. We don't know the exact words that Wanda is using. Wanda could say, "Hey, Sheila, how is your mother?" She could just say, "How's your mother?" She could say, "How's your mother, Sheila?" She could say, "I've been worried about your mother. How is she doing? Tell me how there's a million different ways that she could say that. And all of the possibilities of that response exist simultaneously in our head. And a lot of the time, we're going to sort of naturally boil it down to the exact thing that we have here. How's your mother? She's fine. A lot of the time, we're going to boil it down to that, sort of necessarily. But the possibility space of that is is interesting. And it gets a lot more interesting when we start to move outside of the realm of the obvious. So let me let me say this. Let me give you another example. Wanda asks how Sheila's mother is doing. Sheila says that it's been lovely weather lately, hasn't it? Okay, now what's happening? Well, Wanda asks how Sheila's mother is doing. Same sentence. Does Sheila answer? We actually don't know. We don't know if Sheila has answered. Maybe she did, and then she followed up by saying that it's been lovely weather, right? And we can actually imply that Sheila does answer. And I'll show you how we make that implication, right? So let me copy it. Let me add just another sentence. It's the new bakery down by the dog park has opened yet. Okay, what does this do? This creates the impression, again, that we're having a conversation back and forth, and that these people are actually responding to each other. There's room that There's room to create this idea that Wanda asks how Sheila's mother is doing. There's an invisible Sheila says her mother's doing fine. She says it's been lovely weather lately, hasn't it? Wanda says, yes, it's been lovely weather lately. And she wonders if the new bakery down by the dog park is opened yet. So there's a version of this conversation. And because they're going back and forth without commenting on the fact that they aren't answering each other, now it means that they are answering each other. And we actually don't know what they're saying. The conversation is happening invisible to us. Sheila could have said something incredibly important about her mother, right? And we just don't know what it is, and we don't get a reaction to it, right? Like, or Wanda asks how Sheila's mother's doing it. Sheila says it's been lovely weather lately, hasn't it? Wanda frowns. Now we know Sheila didn't answer because Wanda was expecting an answer and she didn't get one. Do you see? We can use implicit dialogue, words without words, to create, well, implications. Implicit dialogue is an incredibly powerful tool of subtext. And you can mix implicit and explicit, right? Like, watch this. So, Wanda asks how Sheila's mother is doing. Hasn't the weather been lovely lately? Every day it's perfectly warm. Man, that is so much subtext. Because now we have, what do we have? We have the implication. We don't know how Wanda has asked the question. We don't know what Wanda's talking about initially. She could be talking about, oh, how's your mother lately? I've missed speaking to her, right? It could be a very casual thing, like how I asked my mom, like, oh, how's the dog, right? You ask something very, soft. But look at how Sheila responds. Because Sheila's response is the way it is, because Sheila responds in explicit dialogue, we now get the impression of a dodge. And with the impression of a dodge, we get the impression that when Wanda asks how Sheila's mother's doing, she's not asking casually or politely. We now get the impression Sheila's mother has not been doing well, and Wanda has known about it for a long time. And when she asks, how is your mother doing? Or when Wanda asks how Sheila's mother's doing, we don't know the exact words that she used. We understand that there's a grim feeling because of the transition from implicit to explicit. Let's reverse it. So we have an explicit thing. How's your mother doing? I've been worried about it after the news last week, right? So we have explicit information that it's been. I'm just copying the same. If you see me copying the same sentences over and over, it's because I'm interested not in the sentences themselves, but in their permutations and combinations, right? Okay. Now we have explicit knowledge that Wanda is worried that this is a grim question. Sheila says that it's been lovely weather lately, hasn't it? Now, what does it feel like? It feels like Sheila is answering implicitly, right? Wanda is explicitly worried, and Sheila's dodge of the question is an answer. When Sheila says that it's been lovely weather lately, hasn't it? By not answering the question, she's saying that things aren't going well. This is the power of implicit and explicit dialogue. This is what these techniques are capable of. Um, so why is this important? Why do I bring this up? And why is it matter so much for prose, even beyond these communicative examples? The really useful thing, I feel like I'm about to sneeze, by the way. I'm gonna pause. Let's see. Let's see. Delightful. So the thing about this sort of technique is I'm using this in micro, right? Like I'm using these in one, two line combinations. And that's just because of their power as implicative tools, right? What about in longer dialogues? One of the things I see a lot, both when I help edit or beta read or, coach someone, and frankly, when authors come out and say, I'm having this problem, what people talk about a lot is feeling like they have too much dialogue, or their dialogue drags on too long, or their dialogue feels like dead and lifeless, right? It's like, oh, it's just talking and talking. How do I keep my characters from talking so much, or how do I make it okay for my characters to talk so much? And one of the ways to go about that is to, and this isn't bad advice, is to get really good at explicit dialogue, really good at explicit dialogue. Do the thing where you have those idiosyncrasies, where when a character says something, like they say it with a lot of personality, or go by that rule where every single line a character says has to be deeply meaningful. It has to kind of fight for its life. um really maximize the utility of your explicit dialogue. And that's not bad advice. I think it's just a little bit incomplete. If your characters need to be having a conversation, they don't always need to be having that conversation out loud, right? Like one of the places this comes up a lot is like if with world building or explaining, right? Like when you have a character who's being caught up to speed on events and they're talking about it, um, it's like Marco, you know, what's an example of this? Like things were crazy in the throne room, said Marco, nearly out of breath at just the memory of it. Hundreds of soldiers running in every direction. I can go on and on about this, right? And if you have one character explaining, especially if we've seen this already, right? If we've seen this, having Marco tell it to Elizabeth, our girl Elizabeth, pulling her in. If we've seen this already on page or have it discussed before, this will drag and drag and drag and drag, right? Whereas, Marco told, why can I not spell the word Elizabeth today? What's happening in the throne room, right? If we already know what happened in the throne room, we know what Marco is saying. We know what Marco is saying, right? And what that does is it sort of lets us skip what we already know. And more to the point, it lets us imagine Marco saying it in the way that we have come to know him. If we know Marco well as a character, if we're deep into the book and we've been talking to the, or we've been like watching this guy for a while, when he tells Elizabeth what happens in the throne room, we don't need the author to do the work of sitting us down and giving us all his voice lines. We know how he tells. We can imagine it for ourselves, you know? And we can get away with instead focusing on other things. She watched his eyes drop towards his feet, right? We can get away with like this little two. If we already know about the hundreds of soldiers, we can turn this into a very different kind of feeling. Or imagine that we don't already know what happened in the throne room. Like imagine that we don't know about this is actually Marco is describing for us a scene that we haven't yet observed. Marco told Elizabeth what happened in the throne room. She watched his eyes drop towards his feet. I know I'm not with all the way. He murmured like a dewdrop. I like that. Right? So like, what are we doing here? We actually don't have a lot of explicit dialogue. All of it's implicit. But think about the actual length of this conversation in the head of the reader, right? We have very few spoken lines, but he spent a few minutes describing the uniforms, their weapons, the way they were moving, the looks on their faces. That's a few minutes that pass, right? But our time control, remember, like a lot of the problems with writing come down to time control. Our time controls, we've made a few minutes pass in a very short span of time. They weren't surprises, and that was that. The matter turned next to how, but it didn't get very far. Things should have been buttoned up tight. This is a huge amount of dialogue. This is a huge amount of back and forth, even though it didn't get very far. It's a huge implied conversation that we don't need to see. Even though our characters are just standing around talking, all that time has passed for us, and we get the impression that we need without wasting. And I don't want to say that wasting time because reading is a good use of time, but we haven't wasted the reader's time. I hope I'll stop it here for now because I don't want to waste your time. But I hope that these examples kind of help nudge you in the direction of thinking about use of implicit or subject or whatever you want dialogue, right? Abstract dialogue, however you want it. I hope that this helps push you in that direction. I hope that these examples, as you do your own writing, drafting, and editing, in editing, this is a powerful tool. I hope that it helps you find ways of kind of speeding up the prose or or using implication to get more out of less, right? And I will see you all next time. Thank you so much. Feel free to leave a comment, like, and whatever the people do. Yeah, whatever. All right.